I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I am so excited for today's project. Today I am going to create a set of 5 tonal colors, and we are going to test out the depths of shade and the blending of these colors on mini skeins first. This is a technique I recommend because it can be less expensive to play around with colors on mini skeins before trying something on full skeins and then wanting to tweak that, and so therefore re-dyeing it. And plus, I love playing around with different colors and mixing them. So I'm very, very excited for this project. Before I go show the colors and talk a little bit more about the plan, I'm gonna give a huge shout out and thank you to my lab partner, Caitlin J. Caitlin, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. And I'm so excited by this project that we discussed. I know that Caitlin plans to eventually make some kind of mandala with these colors. And Caitlin also suggested a starting palette of a burgundy, an olive green, and an ivory. And I thought that this could be really pretty. And I went to a color picker mixer, a digital color mixer, and came up with this tentative palette of 5 colors. I don't know if this is exactly what we're gonna hit. The hues might be right, but as far as a general plan and concept, this is what I am going to aim for. And the 3 colors I plan to use to try to hit this vision are Dharma's Cabernet, Moss Green, and then Champagne. I think I have some other ivory leaning colors, and I honestly have not used many of them at all. I like the way that this palette works together, and I think I can use it to create the vision. Now, the concern and the thing keeping me from just mixing everything at a 1% depth of shade and doing 2 colors that are 50-50, the moss and Cabernet, and 50-50 champagne and moss, is that these colors are gonna have different amounts of pigmentation, different amounts of punch on the actual yarn. Cabernet is extremely pigmented, and moss might be a lot less, which isn't a bad thing, but we may need to do a ratio that is, say, 75% moss, 25% Cabernet, or something like that. Similarly, the champagne may not need to be used at a 1% depth of shade. A 1% depth of shade of that color might be too dark. And so this is another reason why we're gonna get started on some mini skeins, because I know that whatever we play around with, we can end up with some beautiful results. I don't have mini skeins of the exact yarn base that I'll be using in the end, but I am gonna start with a similar base. I will note that if you are gonna go and work on minis to eventually dye like a sweater's quantity worth of yarn, I would recommend actually making minis out of the same yarn base, so that way the color that you go for later on will reflect the exact same sourcing of merino and superwash as what you're doing on your samples. But for our purposes today, I think that this comparison should work really, really well. This yarn is Wool to Die For's Crazy 8 DK. It's 100% superwash merino. And the yarn I plan to dye in the end is Knit Pick Swish DK, which is also 100% superwash merino, but that's only 4-ply versus the 8-ply Crazy 8, so there are some differences there. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to make up some dye stalks of our 3 acid dye colors. I measured out 5 grams of each of the colors and dissolved that in some hot tap water, bringing the entire volume up to 500 milliliters. So we have a 1% stock solution with a ratio of 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of liquid. My plan for today is not to do a triad color mixing exercise or something that is quite that organized. I plan to be a little bit more random and go a little bit off of feel as I see how the colors are combining together and get a feel for the relative intensities. And so I do have 10 20-gram mini skeins pre-soaking in plain tap water right now, but we may end up needing more as I play around with this. Now, unlike paints, which have a opaqueness to them, so if you take an ivory and mix it with a moss, you're adding that white in there. And that isn't the case here. So yes, you would be diluting the pigment in the moss, but when we think about trying to achieve that green sort of in between. We've got to keep that in mind that we're not adding white. Our champagne dye is fairly yellow orange, but I might need to go even less with the champagne, but I think I want to start with a 0.5% depth of shade. So for our 20 milliliters of yarn, I'm only going to add 10 milliliters of this champagne color. And that still looks like it could be a fair amount. That's a fair amount of pigment there. For the moss green, let's go ahead and start at a 1% depth of shade. So we're going to add 20 milliliters. The depth of shade is the number of grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn. So a 1% depth of shade would be 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. But in this case, we're adding 0.2 grams of dye for 20 grams of yarn. The Cabernet I know is fairly intense, and I may choose to adjust this once I see what these first 3 colors look like. But we're gonna do just a 0.5% of our Cabernet dye. So just 10 milliliters there. And now I want to, I guess, quickly stir these up, starting with the ivory, because you can see it looks like a fair amount of color, but compared to what we have over here, it's not very much. I should add, I started with 1 cup of plain tap water in here. And while my tap water is slightly acidic, I have not yet added acid to any of these containers. I just squeezed out most of the water from our mini skeins. The setup I'm starting with here is a cold process setup. Oh, that actually might be really, really nice. Really nice. It's gonna add, I'm going ahead and sticking my fingers in because there's so little pigment. It's adding something that takes it beyond the bare white, and I think is really nice, especially if when we eventually dye it, we get a hint of some tonal variation, so it's not completely even. All right, but I was starting to say, I am doing a cold process. Like everything is cold right now. Ooh, this green is lovely. Everything is cold, and so some dyes do shift their color and their hues a bit, or have other colors that come out with heat and acid. So the results that we're seeing could vary a bit if we were to be starting with something that was already hot. But I will say I'm really liking the champagne at half strength with the moss at, I guess, full strength. Some dyers go a much above a 1%. And I'm thinking, looking at this, I think that these 3 colors look great together. But I do think I want to increase, I'm going back and forth, because we're gonna need a color that's in between the moss and the Cabernet. So you know what I'm gonna do? For sample 4, we're gonna do the Cabernet at a 1% strength. So I'm gonna add 20 milliliters of the Cabernet here. And so this will help me see the color dry in the end, and that way I can make sure that it is, that what I've got is burgundy enough. Yeah, I have played with the Cabernet a lot. It's actually now one of my favorites, but I know that a little bit goes a long way. You need just a tiny amount if you want it to be a pastel. So let's just see how it compares. Yeah, so I think that when it is dry and when it absorbs all the color, this one is going to be a much deeper. They may not look that different at the moment, but I'll be glad to have both, so that way I can decide if this is a little bit too deep and know if I want to do something in between the two or go even lighter or potentially even darker. But I don't think I'm going to want to go darker. For the 5th sample, let's start with 15 milliliters of moss. And we're gonna do 5 milliliters of the Cabernet. When the color is so deep, it can be harder to see where you're measuring. Okay, we're gonna need to stir that up. So this sample right here is still technically at a 1% depth of shade. We have a total of 20 milliliters of dye, and it's bringing us this beautiful brown. And I'm excited because I think my gut maybe has got us to a good starting point. I considered starting with a 1-to-1, but just had a feeling that that might lean a little bit too Cabernet. And so my hope is that both the hue here will be a nice midpoint between the green and the red, but also that the saturation of the color will be a nice midpoint. You know, I may want it to be a little bit more, goodness, a little bit more red. Maybe I should have just gone in with a 50-50. I still have 5 samples left, but I'm very happy with this color-wise, and I'm curious about how it'll look dry. I think that this brown would not work as well next to the half strength Cabernet. I did have, these are all labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But this brown might work, you know, because that is getting so much deeper. It is a very good midpoint. Maybe I would want it to be a little bit less saturated. So, maybe I want more green. And a little bit less of the Cabernet. But we'll play around with that in a moment. Let's get another sample and we'll try to do something over here. Okay, for our midpoint here, I think I want to do a 1-to-1 ratio of the champagne and moss green, but I'm gonna do it at a reduced depth of shade. So I'm gonna use 5 milliliters of our champagne dye, which really, that's not very much. It's gonna have almost no impact. And then I'm gonna add 5 milliliters of the moss green. So while it's 50-50 these colors with a total depth of shade of 0.5, because the champagne is pretty much no color, this should be much lighter than this green, because I don't think the champagne's really gonna shift that color very much at all. But we may want to go even lighter so that way we have a color once we have the yarn here that feels like it fits halfway between those. But the color we have on the yarn does contribute to the final color. Ooh, I really, really like that, what I'm getting with these dips. Now, once we absorb all the color, will the color be deeper? Maybe. But this isn't bad as a first attempt. It's really not bad. I think that it could be a little bit lighter. So I think my plan now, and as it's sitting here, our brown color here is getting much more red feeling. We're feeling more and more of that Cabernet come. So I think that what I need to do for these 2 intermediate colors is move one closer to the green and the other a little bit closer to the champagne. Okay, for 7, I'm gonna cut the green that I used in half, and we're just gonna use 2.5 milliliters of the moss green color. But I'm still gonna use 5 milliliters of champagne. Again, using this for mixing, it's probably not gonna have a huge impact at all, but it could shift the color a tiny bit, and so that's why it's still just worth doing. Because again, I like this green here, and I'm just afraid it's gonna feel darker in the end. And if I end up with yarn left over in the end, ooh, that's pretty. If there's yarn left over, then what I might do is try one of the minis at an even lighter depth of shade of the champagne. But I like this green, and I think that this could be spot on. Of course, we're gonna be looking at everything dry because that matters to me here. But I'm glad that I did get something that is lighter, because I think that given how pale this is, there's more of a step function here. And so that is kind of what I want. But my original guess was pretty close. It's just here, the difference between what I see here and here is these are closer together than these two. And so now I feel like I'm more in the middle. I'm having so much fun, Caitlin. This isn't gonna be a huge proportion shift, but I'm gonna use 17.5 milliliters of moss, because I don't want the total color to feel lighter than this. So this time we're gonna do approximately 2.5 milliliters of the Cabernet. So this color here, it's so funny how at first it looks so green. Okay, we still may need to reduce the Cabernet more, but I think that this might bring us a little bit closer. But I will say, whatever software I used that was letting me create a gradient, ooh, that's nice, a gradient of 2 colors, and then sort of pick the hex code of whatever's in between, I found that really, really helpful. Okay, so this is now feeling more brown. This is actually a beautiful olivey brown, and I think that it is, well, they're gonna soak up more color, and as that, the tones are gonna shift. And so we may want to shift the depth of shade of some of these colors. But right now, this feels like it's a little bit more in between versus my first pass. And so I'm really, really happy with what we have done here. I wasn't sure how easy this was gonna be to get the colors, and my first mixes and guesses didn't quite get there. Now, could I have done these mixes and tried it on a paper towel? Yes, but I do want to see what the finished set is going to look like on dry yarn before I commit to it and lean into it. And so I'm very, very happy with these tweaks I've done so far. But I do have 2 more mini skeins, so we may as well do 2 more colors. Okay, let's do those 5 milliliters of the champagne by itself. I love how like orange it looks here, and then how much it really is just, it's like very weak tea. I am, however, extremely grateful that there are, and we'll compare all these to like with a skein of bare yarn at the end too. I'm very grateful that dye companies are working on pre-mixed colors like champagne and ivory, because think about how hard it would be to start and pick colors that would work for that. And so there is not a huge difference between these two, but there is some difference. And so, yeah, if this ends up feeling a little bit too dark, then maybe we'd swap that in and like the way that that works a little better. And so that's just super, super handy. Let's do one more version of this color. And let's do, I think I'm gonna do 19 milliliters of moss, and then just 1 milliliter of Cabernet. Just so that way we have one last comparison. Just because who knows, maybe this will be the winning color. Okay, and this, okay, this time it's not quite brown yet. It is a little bit more olive, actually, which, who knows, maybe we'll like this a little bit more olive green better than the moss green. Moss breaks, and so it's possible that there'll be some yellow pigments that'll come out in the end, but as time goes on, it could feel more and more red, just like these ones have felt more and more red. So, yeah, we have our 10 samples vastly out of order. But actually we do have 2 really nice sets here that we are playing with. So now we do need to add acid though. I am gonna add 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to each of the samples with a tiny asterisk because I'm gonna double it on our deepest colors just because it won't hurt. And those have a lot of pigment in there. And I will go ahead and stir these up before I put the lids on them. And I'm gonna go kind of lightest to darkest, even though I will be wiping off the spoon a bit here, and I spilled a little bit, that is okay. But again, the process I'm doing is a cold process. I'm gonna let the yarn sit in with the dye for 1 to 2 days and let these colors absorb slowly onto the yarn. Now these containers are fairly crowded, and so this would not give us the most even color, but it allows me to do multiple samples side by side, and so it's a technique that I really like. And then after most of the color has absorbed, we will go ahead and steam set the yarn so that way we can have the finished color. Conceivably, I'm now thinking we may want to do a green that is lighter than that, but ooh, I'm glad we did this one. This was looking very olivey green. It still does, but it's definitely shifting and is a little bit more brown now. So I'm glad we did that, because who knows, we may want to shift the color and do something, say in between the two of those. Like we can modify the colors more when we go to the full skeins, but we now we'll have a nice starting point, and that even if I want to do another round of color mixing and developing, I have something that I am happy with as a starting place, and so that is really exciting. But anyway, because as I've mentioned, a lot of colors do sometimes behave differently whether you're dealing with them cold or hot to begin with, I think it could be worth me doing a cold process when I'm dyeing the full skeins and dyeing the yarn in, say, shoe boxes. So that way I am treating those similarly to how I'm treating these samples. But anyway, now we're gonna wait a couple of days. I have, again, the numbers on the side so that way I can keep track of the recipes, but I will actually have the recipes and proportions down in the video description, along with a lot of handy links like to the yarn, dyes, other tools and equipment I like to use in my videos. And so yeah, I always keep track of like how much dye, if I'm measuring versus going by feel, I always have that down. You may need to scroll a bit, but it's down in the video description. So if you want to replicate any of these recipes, you can. But I'll see you in a couple days. I could have set this up as a triangle or some kind of color mixing grid where I would have had a lot of different combinations of 2 or 3 colors. However, I knew that I wanted to do things a little bit more by feel, and so if I had a planned range of recipes I was going to look at, it's possible that all of them would have looked way too Cabernet, and then I would have needed to do more finessing beyond that to get the colors closer to those greens that I was going for. And so I think it would be really fun to do some kind of triangle triad exercise, but I also knew that I was going to be manipulating the depths of shade, and so this, while it might be a lot of me rambling about numbers and stuff, it allowed me to look at the colors and then use my intuition based on what I was seeing to tweak the recipe. And so I guess that this is some of that dyeing by feel that I do. I was just measuring things. So that way I can have a recipe that I can scale up and try to replicate. But anyway, I'll see you in a couple days. I have all 10 samples in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think with the colors wet, it's a little hard to say how I feel about all of them, but I imagine that they will look more different once they dry. So for example, ooh, that's a very pretty sort of greenish brown almost. And this is a brown as well. So I think one of those will be a really good fit for the set. Yeah, they're both pretty different from our 0.5% depth of shade of Cabernet. There is a little bit of color left in the 0.5% and the 1%, which is much deeper than both of those. This was one of our first, I forget the ratios. Sample 5 was one of the first ones, but that is a little too red. I'm gonna go ahead and just remove the rest of these. I'm not expecting to see any color from these other samples, but I'm gonna wanna see everything kind of all together wet, and then I'll decide how I'm gonna steam set them. Try to avoid color transfer. And again, our sample numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So when I go and steam set these, I am going to want to make sure that I keep some things separate. I am going to steam set the greens together, the champagnes together, and then I think these final 5 colors I will group together as well, because you can tell the difference between them. And actually this, if we were to swap those, is a very lovely little fade set, getting deeper and deeper in the burgundy. But I think that for the in between the burgundy and the green, I think we have a lot of good options. So I'm excited. But as I mentioned, I do want to group things together to steam set because I don't want color transfer from the burgundy onto our champagne or onto the green. So we're gonna have our champagne cluster, which hopefully I'll be able to tell which one was darker after the fact. The greens all look substantially different from one another, so I'm not concerned there. And the other remaining samples, I think it's a pretty easy to see which ones have more green and which ones have less green. I'm gonna go steam set things in a steamer basket for 30 minutes. They'll be done separately, or at least not touching as much as possible. And then I'm gonna let the yarn cool completely so we can wash it. Despite my best efforts in having the yarn on opposite sides of the pot, I still had some color transfer, either from this project or something that I had in the pot beforehand. Even though I did wipe it down, oh well. We'll still be able to determine the colors that we want for the full-size colors. It's not the end of the world, but I am a little bummed. So I will probably over dye these two to a green for whatever kind of set I'm gonna do with the minis. You know, the more I think about it and the more I look at the color, I really do think that it came from what was in the pot beforehand, which was this. Because this looks a lot more like the teals in here than the moss. Bummer! I suppose when I have something this pastel and I'm gonna steam set, if I'm concerned, I should absolutely not just wipe the pot, I should wash the pot, but I should also consider like putting it in the steamer basket in a container so that way I know that it is more protected. Things to consider for the future. Lessons learned. I'm gonna wash our ivories and greens together because that's what I'm gonna do. I am very curious to see how the ivory color compares to just the undyed yarn. You probably could get away with the undyed yarn as that first color, but I like the idea of there being like, especially because maybe the champagne breaks, there being some tonal variation. But yeah, I probably needed to wipe the underside of the steamer basket. It's possible that some dye got on the bottom, so when I wiped the inside, I was like, oh, it's fine, some color could have wicked up. So I'm going to use a little bit of some clear dish soap, forgetting briefly that this is the one that has ethanol in it, which I don't know if that causes, or if those videos have come out yet, if that causes an issue with making some colors bleed, but I did, when I was using that to rinse yarn, find more colors that bled than normal. But I am not seeing bleeding here, so I'm going to rinse out the soap, and then we will come back and look at our Cabernet colors. And I'll probably use the other soap because I want success. And if there's gonna be like a soap that disrupts the color and causes more bleeding than otherwise might happen, then it's worth avoiding that. These colors together are like a moody forest. Like, this is a combination I am going to need to play with more. I have a feeling some colorway using this will have to be coming from me because it is stunning. Okay, now initially I'm seeing a little bit of some color, but I'm not immediately concerned because there was some color in some of the liquid that was left, but I'm gonna fill this up with water and add some of this just like standard regular dish soap with fewer ingredients than just whatever it was I could get. I like to do unscented dish soaps because that is just, I'm sensitive to scents myself. But so far, I'm gonna let this fill up, but so far, so good. I was not filming yet, but this looks like a success to me, everyone. I'm not seeing any bleeding. So I am going to finish, just do one more rinse to rinse out the rest of the soap. Then I'm gonna put the yarn through my spin dryer all together, hang it up to dry, and then we'll figure out exactly what recipes I want to use for the 5 skein full skein fade set. Oh, Caitlin, here are the dry samples one all the way through 10. And I am really, really excited. The main thing that's exciting me is how much difference there is in between each of the colors. But now I need to work on the set that I want to create. Okay, so here we have our 0.5% depth of shade and 0.25% depth of shade of the champagne. And there is color there. There is a difference. In comparison with each of these colors, the bare yarn looks almost more like a pure white versus the slight off-white that it is. And between the two, I think I like the lighter depth of shade. It just gives like a little bit of a punch, but it still feels very white and very neutral. So I think that's the one that I want to go with. But actually, I should compare it with the sets and see. But I did want to point out how things compared to just a skein of the bare yarn. Right now I'm starting off the set with 9, 7, and 2. And I like the progression. This green feels perfectly in the middle. I think that this deeper one also looks nice, but it's a little too close to this green. It doesn't really feel like it fits halfway in between, and that one really does. For our burgundy, I'm still a little unsure if I like the 1% or the 0.5% depth of shade. The colors are very, very similar. I may like the 1% a little bit better because that'll also increase the overall saturation in addition to changing the hue. And then we have our 3 choices of what should go in the middle. So let's play around with some combinations. Because actually, I guess the colors kind of go like this. That brown's sort of in between those two. This green is pretty. Let's start with the lighter red. This green is really, really pretty. It is in the middle, but it definitely feels a little bit closer to the green. And then I think that this one doesn't quite work as well. It's a little too close to the red, and it honestly feels a little bit a hair darker. So I think that this like olive brown is pretty perfect. And ooh, but which of these? Which of these? Okay, let's go to black and white because that might help me pick. And if I use the lighter depth of shade, that still is like deeper, at least in these settings. And you see sort of like that progression going down. The 1% depth of shade is even deeper. Ooh, either work. Oh, goodness. Goodness, goodness, goodness. All right, I think I'm gonna go with the lighter one. And I think that I like this one a little bit better for a few reasons. It is not as sharp of a contrast with it going this dark in the 1% depth of shade, while it is still darker. And because it is a little bit brighter, even though it is a deep color, it would show stitch definition a little bit better. Sometimes when things are too dark, some of that stitch definition can get a little bit lost. And so I think that I like that here. But now we have another problem though. And that is that these remaining 5 sets create a beautiful progression of their own. And so, I mean, really, it's not a bad thing. I do think that I'm going to go with this one for the actual colors, but I think that this set is very, very pretty. And it could even still be fine with a skein of bare yarn if I decide that I want to do something else with those champagnes that I dyed that do have a little bit of a stain on them. So I could create some pretty sets out of this and just use bare yarn, or I can re-dye those champagne colors. Even I could go at the same depth of shade because that would look, because either would work for both of these sets. But anyway, I am going on and on about this a lot. So the final lineup I have gone for is 9, 7, 2, 8, and then 3. But if you are interested in trying to replicate the recipe from this set using the recipes I've put on the screen before, this set would be 1, 6, 10, 5, 4. Since we will now be dyeing 100 grams of yarn in each of these colors, the recipes, I just need to multiply the volumes of dye I used by 5. And then we'll be ready to go. I wanted to do a cool vet approach to dye the full skeins of yarn. So that way, if any of these colors behave a little bit differently, depending on the order of heat and acid, we should get similar color results and hopefully not get any surprises. I pre-soaked 500 grams of Knit Picks Swish DK yarn in some plain tap water for a couple of hours. I grabbed 5 plastic shoe boxes that I like to use for dyeing yarn and added 8 cups of plain tap water to each one, and then the dye proportions that I had shared on the previous clip. Once the dye was well stirred in each of the containers, I added 100 grams of yarn, stirred it well, trying to distribute the dye over the entire skein as much as possible, and then I added 2 to 3 tablespoons of white vinegar, stirred things up again, and set the yarn aside for a couple of days to allow the color to slowly bind to the yarn. After a couple of days, I brought the yarn inside to heat set. This time sticking our ivory color inside a large gallon Ziploc bag that I would have open in the steamer basket, just so that way I knew that if there's any residual dye, it's not going to transfer. I steam set all of the yarn for 30 minutes. After the 30 minutes of steaming were up, I set this yarn aside to cool completely so then I could wash it. I washed all of the yarn in plain tap water with some dish soap. I wasn't expecting any bleeding because things worked really, really well with the first round. But I did wash the ivory on its own, and then our 3 middle colors together, saving the Cabernet to have its own rinse moment, just in case that was going to be a bit of a bleeder. After I steam set all the colors, I realized that the 4th color was more of the olive green that I had mixed for number 10. Even though the recipe was that number 8, this is a reason why I often recommend making up your dye stocks fresh, because if some things settle, maybe in the Cabernet but didn't in the moss, that could have affected the proportion that we were mixing. So I decided to do one last sample, following the recipe I had used from number 5 originally, using a total of 25 milliliters of Cabernet and 75 milliliters of the moss green. This is doubling the amount of Cabernet that we had in this full skein sample, and so hopefully that will bring us into the little bit more brown family. But we won't really know until we see how the yarn absorbs all the color, because I think the liquid looked pretty brown when I had done the last one. But anyway, I waited a couple days and then steam set this other skein off camera, and so I will share it with you dry after. The new sample looked a little bit too red, honestly like the mini skein that was that color. So I decided to try the recipe that should have worked one more time. The moss green stock definitely has particulates in it, so maybe the one that ended up too green was a little bit green heavy, or maybe I just really did not measure out enough of the Cabernet dye with that one. Either way, it looks like it's brown, so we'll see if in a couple days it is still brown, but we'll look at all of this all together. Here is the colorway on mini skeins that I wanted to go for on full skeins. And then this is what I ended up with for that first attempt to scale up these recipes. And honestly, I haven't looked at the dyeing footage yet, but I have no idea what happened with this color, because this color right here is not the brown I was going for. It is, however, a nearly perfect dupe for this mini skein that had a lot less of the Cabernet in it. And so I figured, okay, I guess let's try doing more Cabernet. So let's increase the amount of red that we have from what I was going for. And then I got this, which is nice. It matches what that version of the recipe was supposed to be, though. It did not bring us to this brown. So I tried my original brown recipe once more, and this time I got the color that I was going for. So the only thing I can think of is that when I originally got this more army green color, either the fresh dye stock I made wasn't well mixed, but it doesn't really make sense that the dye stocks would behave better when they were a couple days old, especially since the moss seems to have some particulates in it in the dye stock container. What I think is more likely is that instead of measuring out 12.5 milliliters of Cabernet, I only measured out 5 milliliters and therefore had the proportion that gave us that more green color. What I am really glad about are a few things. One, that I had enough of the moss mixed up so that way I could dye 2 extra versions. And 2, that I had played around with the color on miniskeins. So that way, when I got a color that was a little bit too green for what I wanted, I was able to know, okay, let's try doubling the amount of Cabernet I thought I used, and that ended up too red, and so then it showed me where to try, and I was able to get there and get the color that I wanted in the end. But I will say, these 3 colors look phenomenal together, and I should play around with these colors and do something with it at some point. It's sort of like a perfect fall themed colorway. Ooh, I've got some ideas, you guys. I got some ideas. As for the other 4 colors that I tried to match, they're all really good matches. And I'm really happy that we got some nice tonal variation in the yarn versus it being a true semi-solid, because I think that adds some like fun interest and dimension to projects. The one thing that I'm a little bummed about is this rogue blue speckle. Ugh, come on. But that's the thing with handmade things. Sometimes there are tiny little imperfections, and you know what? That's okay. And Caitlin, if it bugs you, you can cut it out. Thankfully, I think it's just the one, but this could have come from some of those particulates that I was seeing with that moss green dye. But I'm surprised I don't see more of it around. Caitlin, thank you so much for being my lab partner for this episode of Dyepot Weekly. I have had so much fun playing with these colors and planning out this set, and I absolutely love how it came out. We can't forget to see how our champagne compares to the bare yarn on the Swish DK. It is incredibly subtle, but there is a hue difference. It is a little bit deeper on the yarn that we dyed. And so I'm not sure if there will be noticeable tonal variation in this champagne color, but I'm really, really happy that we were able to transform something that is so pastel and just give it a little bit more ivory. I just adore how this came out. I know I've already said that. And so Caitlin J, thank you so much again for being my lab partner for this episode of Dyepot Weekly. And if you at home would like to learn more about how you can become a lab partner, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop, and feel free to send me a message there if you have any questions about the difference between lab partner and last minute lab partner and what bases I have available and things like that. For dyeing questions and suggestions, feel free to leave them as comments on my videos. I do check those regularly and try to reply to as many comments as I can. But I do also have a Facebook group, ChemKnits Lab, which is a great place to share the projects you're working on and ask questions. Often other lab mates will get to the questions before I get a chance to, but it's just a fun way that you guys can share things with each other. You know, the more I play around with color mixing, the more I learn. And so we didn't do a triad color mixing exercise today because I knew that wasn't going to take me exactly where I wanted to go. But I'm starting to have a better feel from just looking at the dyes as I'm mixing them to understand, okay, the Cabernet, is that the color I used? The Cabernet is going to dominate the moss. Therefore, I definitely want to start with a lot more of the moss. And so I'm getting a better feel for that, especially with colors that I haven't used. I've used the Cabernet a fair amount, but the moss I haven't used as much. And so the more you dye and the more you play with other colors, you'll start to get a better feel for how those work. However, I do always recommend going back to miniskeins to play around with your colors and your proportions, especially if you want to create a specific set. And yes, I did not just create the 5 full skeins I wanted to, I created 2 more. But since I have an Etsy shop, it's not a problem for me. But you know, we knew where to go and where to troubleshoot, and I was not as freaked out or frustrated as I might have been if I had just started initially dyeing on full skeins. And these 2 mini sets we ended up with are adorable. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and make sure you're subscribed and turn notifications on so you never miss any new video. I post at least twice a week, often more because there's lots of other bonus videos every month, and you don't want to miss any of it. Thank you so much for watching.